I've got something a little bit exciting to share with you today, and that's a brand new IEM, not just an IEM, but an IEM brand coming out of Greece. The name of the brand is Soundz, that's spelt with a Z at the end. I've got their flagship IEM, the Avant, here today, and it's nothing short of wonderful, and the best news is that it's priced way below some of the other flagships that I think it's going to compete head to head with. Before I get too deep into this review, I do want to flag the fact that every single person hears IEMs a little bit differently. I've done a full video on this and you can check it out at the link in the top corner here. And so it is quite important to note that you might hear different impressions on this IEM and other IEMs. And so what's really important is for you to identify someone that hears pretty similarly to you. And with that in mind, let me tell you all about the Soundz Avant. As I said before, these are a flagship IEM from Soundz. They're a custom or I think universal IEM that you can buy from Soundz. And within each of these shells, you're going to find 10 balanced armature drivers. So it's not so different from other models that have been around for a long time. There's other multi-balanced armature models on the market, whether it's 8, 10, 12 balanced armatures. So there's no specific innovation going on here, it's more the quality of the tuning. And I know I'm letting the cat out of the bag here, there's no suspense, I think these are wonderful. What's going to be key for you though is to understand how they sound in their different modes, I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, and also whether or not they're going to be for you. With those 10 balanced armatures per side, the Avants come in at a 16.5 ohm impedance, which is moderately low, but it's about normal for a lot of IEMs. And they're also 105 decibel per milliwatt sensitivity, so quite sensitive, but not the most sensitive around either. I do find that these will pick up hiss from hissy devices, so do be aware of that, but it's not like they're a difficult transducer for a good quality source. Within each of these, there's a 4-way crossover, and that's going to allow 4 of the balanced armatures to operate in the bass and the mid-bass, 2 in the mid-range, and then 4 in the upper end. I just paused the recording for a moment to double check that it does say on the website that it's a 4-way crossover, but it then also says that there's only 3 divisions of the balanced armatures. So as I said, 4 for the bass, 2 for the mid-range, and 4 for the upper end. So I'm assuming that maybe the 4th way of the electrical crossover is for the switch that we'll get to in just a second, but that's how the balanced armatures are divided up, and I should also mention that they're all made by Danish company Sonion, and the overall resulting sound from these in their normal mode is described as neutral with a slight bass lift. That then brings us to the switch that I mentioned earlier, and this switch is available on both earpieces, and it's going to toggle between the regular kind of neutral mode and what they call immersive mode. It's going to bring a bit of extra bass to the sound and give you that extra feeling that some of you might want, depending on the track, depending on the source, depending on your mood on the day. The final thing that I'll mention about the design of these is that they come in these lovely acrylic molded shells. You can get them as universal, as I've already mentioned, or custom. And in the case of the custom version, something that I really like, I haven't tried it because these are the universal, but something that I really like about the idea of their customs is that the nozzle itself, the final part of the nozzle that goes into the ear canal, is a flexible material. And that's going to make for a much better fit in my experience. I've had customs in the past and I've stopped buying customs these days because what you'll often find is that the rigid materials used to make the customs, because as it goes up the ear canal in the nozzle, what happens is that as you move your head around, if you're opening your mouth, if you tilt your head in different directions, it can change the shape of the ear canal and break the seal. And so theoretically, having that slightly flexible end to the nozzle should make for a more comfortable fit, but also a more secure fit. And I mean secure in terms of not breaking seal as easily. And so all of this so far is sounding really good on paper. I've already told you they sound great. And so you might be wondering the price. What I'm talking about here is a flagship level IEM, and that could conjure thoughts of things like the $5,000 options from Thieaudio, Unique Melody, etc. In actual fact, what you'd be spending if you buy yourself a set of Avants is around about €1,400 for the universal version, or around about €1,600 for the custom version. Now, obviously, depending on the design that you choose, that can go upwards from there. So that's your base price for a very basic version, 1,400 euros for the universals and about 1,600 euros for the customs. And so at that price, these are really appealing, assuming they perform as well as I thought they did initially when put up against some competition. And so that's really what my focus is for this review, is how do these stack up against some other options you might consider for around about the same money, or maybe a little bit less, but definitely flagship options from each brand. Before I get there, the couple of final things I want to mention. I talked about the switch before. I should point out it's very easy to toggle when you want to. It's not one of those things where you need a tool to get to it and switch it, but it's also nicely secured from being bumped easily. So you're not going to take these out and find that one's been switched and the other one hasn't. You're going to know where it is at any point in time, but you can easily toggle it if you want to. I also want to reiterate just how well these are made. They look and feel absolutely seamless. There's no sign of where the top plate joins with the main body of the shell. And then on top of that, we've got a lovely cable too. It's a fairly generic silver-plated cable, but generic not in a bad way. What I mean is there's nothing fancy or extra special about it, but it's a good solid cable that I'd be very happy to keep on the IEMs. I will talk about cable matching a little bit later at the end of this review, but out of the box, these are completely fine and they're everything that I would expect for the money that I'm spending. And so from here, let's start talking about sound quality. As a reminder, all of my testing for these is with the universal versions. I've tried a bunch of different tips on them, things like the Final Audio E-Type tips. I've used the Tangzu Tang Sankai tips as well. I've even used the Beyerdynamic tips from the Zolento 2s, and all those tips work really well on them. It's about finding the ones that tune the sound to be just right for you. I think my favourite, as is almost always the case, are the Final Audio E-Type, but you can find what works for you based on your preferences. Now, if you were to buy yourself some customs, that can change the sound a little bit, but the good news is it's almost always for the better. These sorts of IEMs are often optimized for the custom users, and then the universal version tries to maintain as good of a quality sound as they can whilst compromising for the universal fit. One of the reasons that the customs will generally sound better is that they do take away some of the variables based on ear canal size and shape, because your ear canal is largely going to be filled by the nozzle of the IEM, and that means that the internal sound tubes that the audio travels through, those are going to be a consistent size and shape for every single person. So it's very predictable when they're tuning the IEM, they know exactly what they're working with. Whereas when you go to a universal, the sound tube stops just inside the ear canal, and then the rest of your ear canal dictates things like which frequencies get boosted or cut away. So do keep that in mind. These will be best as customs, but I've reviewed the universals and they still sound fantastic. Specifically what I do here, and this depends a little bit on the tips and the sources used, but across a bunch of sources and with a bunch of tips, what I would say is that the neutral tuning of these without the switch in immersive mode, so the switch in their kind of normal mode, I would describe their sound as generally very neutral. It does occasionally get just a little bit too forward in the upper mids for my taste, but it's very, very slight, and that's going to be so preferential and so source dependent as well. And the key thing for me, and the reason I'm absolutely a fan of these, is because I think they're very true to source. They're not completely sterile and lacking in kind of soul and engagement, but I think they're very true to source and could happily be used as a mixing and monitoring tool if you wanted to. The staging from these is excellent for an IEM. They're realistic and coherent, but there's a great sense of space, excellent imaging, and really good separation of sounds. I think in particular one of my favourite things about them is just how well they focus the image. As you close your eyes and listen to the music, they are absolutely pinpoint in where they place each sound, and that's excellent. That speaks to fantastic tuning and also fantastic management of the phase of the audio. With a lot of IEMs these days at the upper end, companies like Soundz are taking into account the speed at which each of the signals travels and how far it is from your ear. Because you've got different clusters of balanced armatures sending the signal out into your ears through different length tubes, they do have to account a little bit for how long those tubes are to make sure that the sound reaches your eardrum at the same time. That is clearly being done beautifully in the case of the Soundz Avant because the imaging is nothing short of perfect. Coming back to the sound stage for a moment, and I should mention that they are still an IEM, so the stage is still inside the head, but it stretches as wide as it possibly could to about level or maybe just beyond the ears. And the key thing for me is that whilst everything stays inside the head, it's wonderfully spacious. It doesn't feel closed in, it doesn't feel all kind of centered in one mass within your forehead, it does spread out as much as possible within the available space. Detail retrieval from these and resolution is absolutely excellent. I don't feel like they're trying to overdo any detail, they're keeping it very natural, very honest, and I appreciate that. So what I'm referring to there is that some other models on the market, and I'm going to say this without meaning to criticize, but options like the Vision Ears EXT, I think it was called, I can't remember now, it's a while back since I reviewed it, But options like that can sometimes use things like the electrostatic drivers to enhance the upper frequencies and enhance the detail as a result. That can be a lot of fun and really interesting to listen to, but not entirely natural. And that's what I appreciate about the Avant. They deliver all the resolution and all of the detail that I think I ever need, but there's never any sense that they're overdoing it or trying to be fancy or trick me into thinking they're better than they are. They're just a wonderful, natural delivery with buckets and buckets of detail. As a part of that, the transients, the higher frequencies, the leading edges of notes, all of that's delivered with an excellent sense of attack and clarity, but no harshness or no emphasis beyond what's natural. And overall, I'd say that the sound from the Soundz Avant is actually quite smooth. And I don't mean smooth in terms of warm or rich or thick. What I mean is that it's very well controlled and very refined. So you're getting lots of detail, lots of articulation and resolution, but it's all delivered in a way that's never harsh, never sibilant, never difficult to listen to. And in fact, how I've written it up in my notes is that I feel like they balance clarity and what I'd call listenability about as well as I've heard. You don't ever feel like you're missing any bit of detail from the Avant, but at the same time, you don't ever feel like you want to take them out of your ears due to fatigue or harshness from them. They're just a really lovely balance. What that also leads to is fantastic overall tonality. So bass, mids, treble, vocals, percussion, instrumentals, everything's balanced. Everything sits exactly where it should in the mix. Nothing's pushed forward at you. Nothing's pulled back or recessed. It's just really, really natural and honest to the music. In their neutral mode, I'd describe the bass from these as being modest. I don't think they're an overly bassy IEM, but there is definitely enough to give the music body and weight and presence. I generally like a slightly bassier sound overall. I don't mean a bassier sound than these. I mean, I generally like my IEMs to have a bit of extra bass beyond a dead flat line. And what I find is that these have just the right amount. In their neutral mode, depending on the source and depending on the tips that I'm using and the track to a degree, I do find that they're about right for me in neutral mode, and I occasionally want to switch them into immersive mode. A part of what makes them so good is that their bass extension and their general bass levels are very, very good for a balanced armature unit. Balanced armatures are generally not considered the very best for bass compared to things like dynamic drivers or planers, but these have been managed beautifully for balanced armature. In reality, the bass doesn't extend all the way to the bottom, so the very lowest sub-bass is actually missing a little bit compared to the rest of the bass, but the way they've been tuned is quite similar in some ways to things like the Unique Melody Multiverse Mentor and also the Thieaudio Radon 6 that I reviewed recently, both far more expensive IEMs. But the tuning's fairly similar in the sense that whilst it does roll off at the bottom end of the bass, there's enough bass lift in the kind of lower to mid bass range that you never feel like you're lacking any bass. It's been really well handled here, and they're one of my favourite balanced armature bass deliveries that I've heard, right up there along with the Unique Melody Multiverse Mentor and also the Thieaudio Radon 6. And that's very high praise for an IEM that's under $2,000 compared to two models that are in the $4,000 or $5,000 range. Now, unfortunately, I don't have either of those super high-end units here to compare these to, but I know from comparing those other units to some other IEMs I'm about to talk about, I know that the Soundz Avant would be punching right up there, almost as good, if not as good, as those $4,000 and $5,000 units. So that's really, really impressive territory. Before we get into those comparisons, let's talk a little bit about that immersive mode in a bit more detail. And so for this one, what I wanted to do was have a specific track to talk about and tell you what I heard switching between the regular neutral mode and the immersive mode. The track I used was Phoebe by Kerala Dust. And starting off in neutral mode, and I was using the Mojo 2 for this I should mention, starting off in neutral mode with the Mojo 2, and these sounded fantastic on this track. The bass had a bit of impact and punch to it, but was very well balanced with the rest of the track. Vocals and percussion were very separated and defined in space, not in an incoherent way, but just very clearly focused as an image. And then when I switched the switches into the immersive mode, I would describe the change as significant, but not dramatic. And what I mean by that is it doesn't turn these into a completely different IEM, but there's also no doubt you've made a change. With a track like Phoebe, it really brings to life the music when you switch to immersive mode. Now it's like being in a club with fantastic audio quality. You can feel the bass, it's got presence and weight behind it, and it's really enjoyable on a track like this. The bass is now very tactile, you can feel it a lot more, and it's also quite well controlled and still quite tight and punchy. But I'm saying quite tight and punchy because it's not going to be as fast as some of the very best dynamic drivers out there. As I said before, I think for a balanced armature, it's excellent. One of the things I noticed with balanced armatures is that whilst they're quite a fast driver in general, what often happens when we try to get more bass out of them is that the bass you get isn't quite as tight and snappy as some dynamic drivers. Now, all that's going to vary depending on the tuning, the way they're set up, etc. But that's just been my impression, is that when you do have an IEM like these with the immersive mode on, the balanced armature bass can be a little bit less tight and controlled compared to a really good dynamic, and that's what I'm hearing here. That's not a knock, it's just a different presentation, and I absolutely love it. What you also get as a part of switching into immersive mode is that some of that bass boost does bleed a little bit up into the mid-range, but in a really positive way. It adds a bit more weight and body to the mid-range, and it really brings the music to life because it lends a bit more kind of naturalness to the sound. It's a bit more like being live in a room with the musicians, rather than listening to a pair of very clinical, very clean studio monitors. And by the way, overall, as I think I've already said, these are not a clinical or overly sterile sounding IEM, even in their neutral mode. What they are is very neutral and very honest, with just a little extra dash of something, which is probably bass, to bring them alive a little bit. So they're quite neutral, they're quite natural, but not sterile and not clinical. Then with immersive mode on, as I've just said, it brings them to life and makes them very musical and very much like a live venue type sound. In immersive mode, it's also worth noting that by having that bit of extra bass, it does change the staging just a little bit. You don't get quite as much sense of space and separation as you might in the standard mode, but it's a very, very subtle shift. And what's really cool about this is you can just flick between the two. If you want that more neutral, spacious, maybe slightly less engaging sound because you want the technicalities, just switch them into their normal mode. But if you want to kick back and just relax and enjoy some tunes, then you can flick up to immersive and enjoy the bass along with everything else. So I love having the choice, and I love the fact that both choices are great. Sometimes on IEMs like this, I find that I really enjoy them in one mode and don't really enjoy them in the other. In the case of the Avant, I can't really choose which one I like more, and that's fantastic. And so at this point, I was loving what I was hearing from the Soundz Avant. And I was then starting to wonder, are they really as good as I think? Sometimes in isolation, a great sounding IEM or headphone or whatever is amazing, but then you put it up next to the competition and you suddenly go, oh, okay, it's not as good in this area, not as good in that area, or maybe not as good overall. And so the big thing for me was to put this up against a couple of other IEMs that I really, really like. And in this case, both of them are a little bit cheaper than the Soundz Avant. The first option is the Sennheiser IE900, and this comes in at $1,300 US, making it just a little bit cheaper than the universal version of the Avant at the base spec. And when I say base spec, obviously the specifications themselves don't ever change. What I mean is that if you design fancy custom shells, custom in terms of the look and the color and the materials, if you buy universals with a fancy design, it might cost a little bit more. But in the base design, the base look and feel options of these, there's about $100 odd US difference between the IE900 and the Soundz Avant. Listening to both IEMs, one particular track that I used was Boom Like That from Mark Knopfler, and the Avant in their immersive mode sounded absolutely brilliant on this track. The bass and the kick bass sounded full and present and tactile, but the vocals still remained nicely focused and very clean. The guitar had a great sense of articulation, and the percussion was present but not too far forward. It was kind of secondary in the mix, as I think it probably is meant to be. Moving over to the IE900, and they deliver a much crisper, much kind of drier sound. There's more emphasis from the IE900s on sounds like the shaker and the snare, those percussion instruments, and the vocal was much more textured and had less richness to it. I don't think either one I would say is right or wrong or better or worse. They were just different presentations, but very clearly different. One was about texture and clarity and a bit of dryness in the IE900, whilst the other was very musical, very immersive and enjoyable in the Soundz Avant. From the IE900, the bass wasn't quite as tactile or present. It was still really good, and there was still a little bit of thump, but not as much as I was able to get from the Avant. And what the comparison between the IE900 and the Avant really showed me was that as I switched back and forth between the two and played around with the switch on the Avant to try the different modes, what I found was that the Avant for me has excellent tonal balance across the board. I felt like it was more natural and more what I would expect to hear within the room with the musicians compared to the IE900s, and then the ability to adjust for taste with the flick of that switch is a great way to make up for recordings that are a bit too lean or source devices that maybe don't have the body behind them. The key thing was that regardless of which mode I was in, I felt like the Avants always kept up with the IE900s in terms of technicalities. So staging, resolution, image focus, separation, detail retrieval, all of those things were absolutely neck and neck for the IE900, But then to my ears, the sound from the Avants was more neutral and natural across the board. The IE900s are a very clean and neutral sounding IEM, but they do have a bit of coloration. They've got a bit of a scoop out in the upper registers that can do some interesting things for the sound, but it can make them sound a little bit less natural when compared to something like the Avant here. And so knowing how much I love the IE900s, they're one of my favourite IEMs, that's huge praise once again for this Soundz Avant. And so now it was time for me to turn to another favourite IEM in my collection, and that's the Thieaudio Prestige. These come in at basically the same price as the IE900s, making them therefore just that little bit cheaper again than the base version or base design of the universal Soundz Avant. Listening to I'll Fly Away by the Dirty Dozen Brass Band and starting off with the Thieaudio Prestige. And the first things I noticed from the Prestige was that they generally have a good tonal balance, and they provide excellent space and separation on what is quite a busy track. I did feel like the vocals were a bit distant and a bit disembodied from the Prestige, and that's probably because of the recording and the fact that I'm pretty sure they're playing this in a large hall, but the Prestige was able to provide a good sense of kind of weight and body and naturality to all the instruments. However, at the same time, I didn't feel completely engaged by them. Everything was well defined, tonality was quite strong, and technically I could appreciate what I was listening to, but I wasn't emotionally engaged in the music. Moving over to the Avants, and what I found then was that I felt there was a better sense of coherency in the music. There wasn't as much overall space, but everything was very well separated within that slightly reduced space. The sound was also smoother from the Avants, and again I don't mean smoother in terms of lacking resolution, just smoother in terms of a little bit less textured, a little bit less dry, you could potentially say. And what that actually meant was that the horns in the Dirty Dozen Brass Band sounded a bit more natural. They combined both texture and that sort of brassy, resonancy sort of sound. They combined it better in the Avant than I was getting from the Prestige. The vocals that I mentioned before still had that sense of distance to them, but there was a bit more weight to them now. They sounded less disembodied. As I flicked the switch between the standard mode and the immersive mode, in the normal or the neutral mode, I felt like the sound from the Avant was actually quite close in terms of tonality to what I was hearing from the Prestige. But with a track like this, being able to switch on immersive mode just brought the track to life again. And so I think in either mode, I did slightly prefer the Avant on this track over the Prestige. With immersive mode on, I definitely prefer them over the Prestige. But there was probably less difference between the Avant and the Prestige than there was between the Avant and the previous IE900. And as I got to the end of this track, I felt like it was an interesting comparison, but I did want one more track to make notes on, just to get a better sense and to hopefully explain more clearly the differences between these two. And so the next track I found was Old Time Indian by Wild Magnolias. And in either mode on this track, the bass from the Avants is absolutely impressive. It was like being in the room, standing near the bass amp. You could hear the detail, you could feel the bass. It was fantastic. And again, that's whether you're in immersive mode or in the regular mode. The separation of sounds and the layering of instruments in this track is also excellent. Still talking about the Avant here. And I was getting a great sense of rhythm and impact from the Avant. Again, this is regardless of mode on this track. It didn't matter which mode I was in. Both modes were great, and both provided everything I've just talked about. Moving over to the Prestige, and it was again also very impressive. I found the bass from the Prestige had more sub-bass energy. It was a bit more focused down there. And whilst that might initially sound like a good thing, it actually made it a bit less coherent. It was like the sub-bass was off on its own, and then everything else was happening in a different section. I don't mean that spatially so much as tonally. There was too much emphasis on the sub-bass that it didn't blend seamlessly with the rest of the mix. As a part of that, there was a bit of a lack of mid-bass impact. So where I feel like the Avant is probably more about the bass than the mid-bass, the Prestige is more about the sub-bass, and it does kind of cut away a little bit, relatively speaking, in the mid-bass. And that's part of what made the separation apparent between the sub and the rest of the mix. Rather than being a nice, smooth transition between all the frequencies, it was sub-bass, a bit of a gap, and then everything else. The Avant does that much better, I think. Moving up into the vocals, and the Prestige did a great job at separating everything, providing a good sense of imaging and layering once again. But I felt like tonally, the Prestige was lacking a bit of weight and presence in the mid-range vocals. And that's where again I think the Avants are so natural and honest. They give you texture and detail, but also presence and weight and richness and harmonics. The Prestige was lacking a little bit there, and it did hold them back from sounding quite as natural. As we move up into the upper frequencies, the upper registers are a bit more sparkly, a bit more crisp from the Prestige. But again, I almost feel like it goes a bit too far. It makes them sound just a little bit unnatural because there's a little bit too much emphasis. And so that kind of brings us back again to a nice summary of why I think the Avants are so great. and that is that they just do everything so well. There's not a hole in their sound, there's not a rough spot in their sound, other than maybe sub-bass extension if that's really important to you. Everything else is done so well. They're coherent from bass through treble. They've got detail, resolution, imaging, separation, layering and depth in the soundstage. They do everything really, really well. Then add to that the ability to flip the switch and change their sound should you want more bass or less bass. And all of a sudden, you've got kind of a do-it-all IEM. It can go from being a neutral, monitoring and mixing tool in one moment to a kick back and relax and enjoy the music tool in another moment. I found as I listened to those other IEMs that I've mentioned that across the board I enjoyed all of them. But it was the Avant that really immersed me in the music. It had me wanting to listen more and more and more, whereas the others just sounded good. Very, very good. But the Avant was more of an emotional, engaging experience. Now I do want to mention at this time that I've just recently received the new Thieaudio Prestige Limited, and that might be some tough competition based on my early impressions. So if you want to know more about this kind of level of IEM, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell because I do have the Prestige Limited review coming. I will probably have had to send back the Avants by then, so I might not be able to do a full comparison, but I'll see what I can arrange. For now though, the one final thing I want to mention is that I did also try some different cables with the Avant. I'm not generally a fan of silver-plated cables. I find they can often bring a slight sense of edginess or harshness to the sound, and so I did try a few other cables courtesy of Thieaudio. I've talked about most of these on the channel before, being the Aries S8W cable, that's a pure copper cable, and also the recently reviewed Fusion 1 cable, which is a super high-end hybrid cable that I adore. I tried both of those, and also the recently released and recently received by me Eros S First Anniversary cable, also from Thieaudio. And what I would say is that all of them were fantastic with the Avant. I did find that with the slightly warmer sounding cables, that being the Aries S8W, which is a pure copper, and also the Fusion 1, which is a hybrid cable, with both of those, going to a cable that's got a bit less treble energy, I found I didn't want to use the immersive mode quite as much. And so if you do buy these and you want to get the most out of their switchability, then I'd probably say stick with something that's got a bit of silver in it. And that means either you stay with the stock cable or something like the Thieaudio Eros S First Anniversary, which is a combination of pure copper and pure silver, is absolutely sublime with the Avant. By getting rid of the silver plating and going a pure silver instead, what you're getting is all the same benefits in terms of the top end detail. It makes the immersive mode still very valuable, but it takes away any of the harshness, any of the edginess, the little bit of dryness that I talked about at the very beginning of this review in the upper mid-range. That's all gone. So you're getting the same tonality of the Avants with even better, smoother and more refined sound. That's this cable here, by the way. This is the Eros S First Anniversary, and it also looks fantastic with the black shells. If that's what you happen to get, the black shells of the Avant combined with the beautiful black Eros S cable looks fantastic and sounds even better. And so that's my 10 cents worth on cable swapping with the Avant. But the good news is you don't need to swap the cable. It's a nice way to tweak the sound a little bit if you want to, or get different ergonomics if you want to, but the stock cable is just fine. And as I said, having the silver included within the cable that you use with these, I think gets more out of the ability to switch them. With a smoother cable with a bit less top-end emphasis, I don't find the immersive mode particularly useful. And so I think at this point it's a good time to wrap up and say what you've probably already gathered, which is that I absolutely adore the Soundz Avant. I think for the price and the performance, they are nothing short of exceptional. As I said, I would have loved to put them up against some of those really expensive IEMs to see just how close they get, because I think it would be a very tough battle. And for my money, I don't really see the point in spending much more than what you pay for these, because what you're going to get at most is a few % sound improvement. The Soundz Avant are that good. I think they're that well tonally balanced. They provide wonderful clarity, wonderful tonal accuracy, the ability to switch modes. They're kind of everything you could want in a single simple package that's not too expensive. And so if you're in the market for an IEM and you want that top-end experience, then definitely consider the Soundz Avant. I'm certainly impressed. I know they're a new brand on the market that many of you won't have heard of, but don't let that put you off, because you'd be missing out on an absolute gem. And so as always, I hope this video has been useful and informative. Hopefully I've introduced you to something that you might not otherwise have considered. And if you have found the video useful, interesting or entertaining, then please do hit the like button and also subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.